what do you think parents misunderstand about the purpose of school, or what do you think the purpose of school is?
That's a really important question to ask is what are schools for? And I think something that's often missed, or really because we've all been conditioned in schools and systems that are geared towards compliance. And when we remember that education is not about preparing us for going into the real world someday. I think releasing that idea that really education is about living life now. Krishnamurti said, education is not preparation for life. It is life itself. And so um, to really empower kids that you're not just waiting to be grown up in some holding pattern while you learn and memorize the necessary things to operate in the world. You have agency right now to get out there, to make a difference. And that's when learning comes alive.
You are listening to Dedicated Joe, the new dad's guide on the upending and transformational experience of becoming a father. Today I have a guest to talk about a very important topic, which is education, how you pick a school for your kid, something that we think about even if we have babies. They might spend more time at school than they do with you. So this decision really matters. And I did a lot of research on picking the school for Della and also have started schools in the past. So I'm really excited to have Michael Carberry, an education visionary innovator who's created this incredible school, Whole Life Learning Center, which is the school that Della goes to. The Whole Life Learning Center that has about 100 kids and has been around for 15 years. And it really focuses on environmental sustainability and social justice and personal growth and empowerment. And he's just incredibly intentional the way he has looked at the education system, what education is for, and created this very unique model that I think you're going to be really excited to learn about and will help guide you in picking schools for your kids. Well, Michael Carberry, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
Thank you, Joe. I'm really excited to be here with you. Thanks for having me.
We've known each other a long time, 10, 12, 15 years maybe, involved in men's work and spiritual growth stuff. We were both kind of starting education programs around the same time many, many years ago. Mine failed. Yours still is going, thankfully, because now my daughter has an amazing school to go to because you've created the Whole Life Learning Center, which you founded and run for 12 years.
This is year 15 of the Whole Life Learning Center. That's right.
Amazing. Most little schools like that don't make it. So you made it. I've watched it grow and up to about 100 kids now. My daughter's been there she's on year 3 of going there. She started in preschool, what you guys call the Rubies. And now she's in her second year of the Jades. It's a combined K-1 class. And, been really privileged to join the board of the school as you handed it over to a nonprofit. I get to be on the first board. It's been really great watching the school thrive and see all the philosophy that you put into it. So really excited to have you today to help us think about school in general for new parents and what are they going to do for school and what's up with the public school system and what kind of schools are good or not. You're the expert. So welcome.
I'm so glad to be here. And that is certainly one of my favorite topics.
Yeah. How'd you get into education? What's your background in this? What brought you to this?
Both of my parents were educators, met teaching high school together. My dad, a science teacher, my mom, an English teacher. And dad went on to become a food scientist. And I watched my mom growing about 5th grade. She went back to work. And so I watched her return as a high school educator. And as I watched her through my adolescence and growing up, I never would have said, "Oh, I want to be a teacher." That was not on the bingo card for me. I went to college. I was a philosophy major. I worked at my university's music library. I became a music librarian. I went to grad school for library and information sciences. And honestly, it wasn't until finishing those degrees and getting some world travels in that I came upon my own kind of quarter life crisis of what actually am I doing with my life? And am I on a track? I've been on this kind of railroad tracks of my education and get the degree and, get the grades and get the degree and move through it and do the thing that my parents want me to do or society wants me to do. And I realized I wasn't actually on a track that was leading me towards personal fulfillment and like the meaningful life, kind of to make the kind of impact that I wanted to make in my short life. So I did honestly, I did a deathbed meditation. I fast forwarded in my mind to being at some point in the future on my deathbed and looking back and am I really happy? What will I want to have accomplished? What kind of difference will I hope to have made? And so I imagined that, and I imagined really working in communities to affect change. I worked on helping to, I mean, I thought about really inspiring people to do what they love and to get out there and make an impact. And so I realized, although I'd had gone to some good schools and taken some cool classes and had some good teachers, I hadn't actually found a mentor in my life to ask me what lights me up, what am I truly passionate about, and what kind of world do I want to create. So I set out to find mentors and soon thereafter realized I wanted to be a mentor for others. So I made a list I drew a line down the middle of my journal and I wrote on one side all the things that I love, everything I was passionate about. And on the other side, on one side I put love and the other side I put service. And I wrote all the ways that I could help, all the ways that I could make a difference, the people that I could potentially work with, who and how could I serve? And so as I made that love and service list, it just set me on my path as a holistic educator, as a mentor. So I sought out my own mentors, including some great folks in an organization called Self Design. Worked with an amazing gentleman, Dr. Brent Cameron, who was instrumental in kind of helping me find my educational philosophy. And and then I was up and running. So I realized, I didn't want to be a teacher in the old paradigm. I was ready for the education, to be a part of the education revolution. And that's what got me doing this work.
That's awesome. Yeah, I got a similar experience. I was got really involved in activism and social justice, and was really angry, wanted to tear down the system, and also had a similar realization of like, what am I building? What am I creating? And can't tear down the whole system all at once. So what would I want to change? And I suffered a lot in the school system. It's one of my deepest traumas were from being in the traditional school system, and so decided I really wanted to change that for kids. And that led me to want to start schools and explore alternative education, and then eventually starting Serenity Kids as a weird, unexpected turn towards helping kids, but food and diet being a big key part of that. And still would love to start a school someday, but like for now, happy to support Whole Life because it's very challenging business model, very tough to do. So, when you became a parent, you had this idea to start school, and then you became a parent after you had kids, after you started schools, right?
That's correct.
Yeah. So what kind of surprised you about how children learn from, both as an educator, but then also as a parent? What did you learn about the way kids learn? Hey, Della, what's your favorite cereal?
Lovebird. Hi.
What do you like about it?
It's yummy.
It tastes amazing. It actually contains real nutrition. It's not just empty carbs like most cereals.
Wait, I didn't know that.
It's grain-free and gluten-free, low in sugar, and there's no artificial or highly processed ingredients.
Really? It's low sugar? But it tastes so good.
All the ingredients are things you recognize. They're all whole foods. This is the most different thing about this cereal than even the other natural cereals because there's just nothing ultra-processed in there. Plus, it's tested for all contaminants like heavy metals, glyphosate, nasty stuff like that you don't want. And we know the founder, Parker Brooks. He was on the show. He made it for his daughter and is just a fierce advocate for cleaner food. So check out the show notes for a special discount code link for Lovebird cereal.
How can I open it?
The biggest realization I had about the way kids learn once I became a parent and was really that learning is happening all the time through play, in nature, through struggle. These are just constant learning opportunities. We are natural learners, children especially. Even if you think about the process of acquiring a language, and how much learning and growth is happening not through formal instruction, but just through relationship. That was a big awakening for me.
And so the idea of school is supposed to be for learning. We want kids to learn, want them to grow, become better. That's what most parents think school is for. What do you think parents misunderstand about the purpose of school, or what do you think the purpose of school is?
Yeah, I think sometimes what parents may miss about the purpose of education, and then, by the way, that's a really important question to ask, is what are schools for? And I think something that's often missed, or really because we've all been conditioned in schools and systems that are geared towards compliance. And when we remember that education is not about preparing us for going into the real world someday, I think releasing that idea that really education is about living life now. Krishnamurti said, education is not preparation for life, it is life itself. And so um, to really empower kids that you're not just waiting to be grown up in some holding pattern while you learn and memorize the necessary things to operate in the world. You have agency right now to get out there, to make a difference, to start your business, to create your art, to start your campaign, whatever whatever they are inspired to create, that there's opportunity to start doing that right now and collaborating with their peers and getting involved in their community. And that's when learning comes alive.
Thanks for that. There's a lot of criticism of the public school system, people outside of it, people inside of it. Hardly anybody says, oh, our school system is perfect and we love it. Even teachers and administrators, everybody's criticizing it. It's often under attack, and are also being defended constantly as the only way, for us to learn, us to grow as a society, or for underprivileged people to be able to elevate their status. So given all that, what do you think are the challenges of public schools? Like, what's wrong with them, or what do you think? What is your critique?
Well, what's wrong with, I'll say, the traditional model of education is it did develop in tandem with the industrial age, right? And that's not the education system's fault. It's just a historical fact that the way and the timeline of which our current still existing traditional model of education existed is rooted in an industrial mindset, where it was essential to have standardization. Albert Einstein says, I love standardization for automobiles, not for humans, paraphrasing there. And it was a time where it was really important to have compliant factory workers, et cetera, going into the workforce, not necessarily creative, emotionally intelligent humans. So whereas there was a rooted vested interest in control and conformity in that traditional model, we are focused in holistic education on really cultivating curiosity and connection, self-awareness, self-confidence, helping develop wonder and awe, the kinds of things that really support young humans to grow as lifelong inspired learners.
Yes, you're saying this is not that anything wrong with the school system. It's just sort of like, what is it designed to do? And if it's designed to create workers who don't question orders and comply with policies and go from one station to the next with the ringing of a bell and, respond to punishment or reward, kind of manipulative control, like those kinds of things, memorize and repeat instructions, great for a factory worker or maybe a soldier, if you're in the military.
Absolutely.
So soldiers and I think even consumers, like, buy this thing next, like it's great at creating consumers and, and low-level workers. But then our economy doesn't have a lot of factory jobs. There's,
Exactly.
we're not trying to track everybody into the military. With all this talk of innovation and new ideas and collaboration, as an employer, we hire people who know how to work on a team, who have new ideas, who are able to handle stress without being overwhelmed, are able to be vulnerable about what they need, ask for what they want. Like, these are all skills that I certainly didn't learn in school. And it seems like the traditional model, which I think, to be clear, you're not saying this is just a public school problem. You're saying traditional school. This is sort of like, it's not like private schools are the answer.
Private, charter,
Any
absolutely.
school that is structured this way where it's about compliance, it's about memorization, it's about standardization. Everybody meets one standard, comparing them all to this A, B, C, D, ranking system. That
Exactly.
is fundamentally a problem. It doesn't matter if it's public or private.
Exactly. Some people say like, oh, the educational system is broken. It's like, well, it's is it broken? It's actually functioning the way it was designed. So it's not necessarily about being broken. And it's not to say that I don't want to, I am absolutely about, when I say the education revolution, I'm talking about really evolving traditional models of education, not just doing our thing over here on the side. But one of my favorite authors, Daniel Quinn, he said, when I was kind of in that phase of deciding my own path in education, I read something that he wrote that said, trying to change a system from within, or trying to change an organization with programs, by bringing in your program, is like trying to put a stick in a river and hoping for it to change course. And really, what's much more effective is to start carving out. And it may start out as a trickle. Some of those trickles may dry up here and there, but eventually, with enough aligned community and vision and purpose, that trickle will turn into its own stream and its own river. Eventually, it's not about, I think Buckminster Fuller talked about, you can't change a paradigm from the consciousness of which it was created. It's really, we need to focus on creating the new paradigm so that when this other one is obsolete, is really demonstrated to be obsolete, we already have another one up and running. Come on over.
Create alternatives. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's what I determined too, is you can't just tear down what isn't working. You have to build the alternative, or otherwise there's nothing to go to.
Exactly.
When I was working in public education, they brought in this professional development speaker for all the teachers in the district. And he talked about the challenge of generalist versus specialized, and that our economy needs specialists, people who are really good at one thing. And the education system is general. So it wants everybody to get a little bit of everything.
Mm-hmm.
And as the kid who loves art or who loves math is now forced to spend time learning English or other things that aren't their strength, and it's less time they have to devote to their specialization. So do you find that as well, that like the specializing versus generalizing is important?
Yes. In specializing versus generalizing, of course, we all want to have some basic skills that will support us in our passions, right? So, but the most important thing is making the learning relevant. So if I'm really passionate about my art, and maybe I'm avoidant of math, or let's say it's a child that I'm working with, I can demonstrate that actually there's so much math in nature and the way that it's used in art. And we can look at the golden ratio and Fibonacci spirals, and we can look at all these kinds of things, or, start, cutting our own canvases and deciding on how many square inches we want to have on a certain canvas and how that works out. And so make the learning we can bring in literacy and math and science or whatever it might be through so many. Maybe it's the other way around, someone who is incredibly mathematical and avoidant of art. And then we show them that there's all sorts of math and art, and all of a sudden it unlocks that door. So the key is really, it's not as much about generalist versus specialist. I think as much as making things personalized and relevant so that the child can find, like, what's in it for me? Why should I learn algebra? And, to be able to demonstrate that as an educator and show some purpose in that. And then it doesn't have to be about passing a test or just memorizing, but really finding a way to bring that learning to life.
Yeah, you're kind of talking more about motivation there. Like you can use the child's interest, what they're passionate about, to
absolutely
guide, to have them learn lots of different subject areas, like its interdisciplinary approach to environment or art or cooking or music or video games or whatever it is, that like you can find ways to use something they're passionate about to have them learn the things so that they can pursue that passion, not just learning in and of itself.
Absolutely. Yeah. To bounce back to a couple questions ago, you asked about what are schools for, or the purpose of education. And really, I think the purpose of education is self-actualization. It's becoming more and more of who we are, discovering that, creating ourselves. And that means finding what we love, what we're passionate about, uncovering our gifts, developing those gifts, and learning ways to share them with the world and make the world a better place. And in that, we find meaning and purpose and joy. And to me, that's the bigger picture of what education is all about. And so in that, absolutely, that's about specialization, but also having the skills to bring that, to share that specialization, that passion with the world in a powerful way.
Self-actualization. That's kind of like the purpose of life, maybe. Or I also, if you were to say, what is my one purpose as a parent, would be to help my kid become their full self,
Yes.
That's powerful. I think some parents might say it's to be financially successful, like to make money or to go to college. But even the college, well, why go to college? Oh, so they can get a job and make money. So what role does the financial or job or money piece have? What role do schools play in that?
Right. Those are great side effects of developing as someone who is inspired, knows what they love, is in touch with their passions and their gifts, and is motivated to share those things with the world and contribute. So those are great side effects of those things, is that people who are doing that are naturally attracting collaborators, are being asked into organizations and positions, and they're able to navigate the world in a way that is seen as successful. So absolutely, those are important things. Being able to function in society, be able to get a job where you can find fulfillment. The key is, and I mentioned this in my own path, right? Finishing a graduate level degree and not knowing what I wanted to be when I grew up. Like how did that successful schooling work out for me, right? I wasn't in touch with those big questions. So we start asking those questions in kindergarten, in preschool, and all throughout, and let those answers and that relationship with my own learning and my own evolution develop through that course. And it's a lifelong process. So, really learning how to learn. If we've got that, we can learn anything, but I'm not sacrificing my purpose, my own fulfillment just to get the job. And then, getting to that point, getting to that midlife crisis and realizing like, I'm halfway through my life and I am not happy, and now I need to try to figure it all out. I mean, how many people do you know our age who have kind of gone through a process like that, where they, get to this point in their life and they might tick off, certain metrics of success, but they're actually unfulfilled. And that's why I say self-actualization is actually the larger purpose of holistic education, because, and I think it ought to be the purpose of education in general, because, what else are we here to do on this planet? And it just makes for better lives. It brings more joy and connection into our lives. Imagine a world where everyone is truly finding meaning and purpose in their work, is feeling that their contribution is valued and is connecting with their community in that way. I mean, I think that's the world that we're creating.
Well, I certainly know a lot of people with very advanced degrees or who are very financially successful that are not self-actualized or even happy or fulfilled, that they spend a lot of their time unhappy. I can't say that I know anybody who I'd say is self-actualized, knows who they are, is genuinely happy, that is broke. Like there's people who maybe they're not like rich or whatever, but like, I would, the homeless people I've met or the people in deep poverty, I would not say that like, oh, if only I'd spent more time in college, I would have more money. And, like that if they found self-actualization, but they are still living in their parents' basement, it's interesting that it does seem that if you pursue self-actualization and that higher calling you who you are, that the money will come, right? And whether if their goal may not to be super rich, but like that, like you can be happy and be your full self and be fulfilled and financially successful. Who wouldn't want that for their kid to like have money and be happy, right? I feel like we just want them to be happy. First, I'd almost rather my kid be poor and happy.
Absolutely.
Than rich and unhappy like most people are, but I'm not sure if most parents feel about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that we can, talk about the different levels of richness that one can have. And I think, and also, maybe getting out, being in one's early 20s and not having necessarily, say, landed on their feet or transitioned into a fully self-reliant adult. Like that's not poverty. That is growing up. Like that's like taking the leap into, so, let's look at the wealth of community. And that's something that we, in a hyper individualistic society that is neglected often, but it adds so much to personally. Was just reflecting this morning on what an amazing community we have, and the friends that we're woven in with, and just the richness that comes with that, but also the natural opportunities by being part of a diverse, activated community, that we can grow in. That naturally leads, I think, to more success, because when you're connected in your community, when you're contributing, you're seen, that leads to wealth on so many levels.
Yeah. So if self-actualization is the goal, what are sort of the pillars of an education paradigm that would fulfill that?
Yeah, with self-actualization as the goal of education, I would say there are three main things in a model of holistic or transformative education that help get us there. And first, that starts with social emotional learning. A foundation for all the academic learning is really knowing who I am, being able to regulate my own emotions, express my feelings, really develop in emotional intelligence. Along with that,
So let's take them one at a time. So social emotional learning, it's a term. It's even in the public education, they talk about this.
absolutely.
And it's basically what, like, teaching emotions, teaching how you name emotions, how you know what your feelings are, how you understand feelings in others.
Right. Understanding my own feelings, being able to regulate those, and then also learning how to understand someone else's emotions, have empathy, and then be able to communicate around those things, and being able to work those things out. And there are things that we use like nonviolent communication and conflict resolution. All of those things are really practicing that SEL, social emotional learning. It also includes developing a growth mindset. I think that's a huge part of that social emotional foundation for lifelong learners. And that's in juxtaposition of a fixed mindset where, well, I'm good at this subject, but I'm not good at this, and that's kind of the way I am. A growth mindset says I can continually grow and get better at things with effort and with support, with iterations and perseverance. I can always grow and get better at things. And so I know myself as a learner, as a lifelong learner.
Why does understanding our feelings or those of others encourage a growth mindset?
So emotional intelligence sets us up to be strong communicators, but it also sets us up for resilience. So it might be, I've got a story of a kid just a couple weeks ago, and I was walking back across the front porch of our campus, and someone in the Jade class, they were doing jump rope out in the front yard. And I noticed someone hiding behind one of the columns of the front porch, and as I walked by, he kind of slinked to the side. So I took that as my invitation to check in. And so I said, "Hey, bud, what's going on?" And he said, "I'm not good at jump rope." Could tell he was really frustrated. I keep on messing up. And by the way, we have a theme every week at the Whole Life Learning Center, a theme of the week and a quote of the week that's based on our SEL curriculum. So it's supporting that social emotional development. It's a core of our curriculum. The theme that week happened to be learning through challenge. It's perfect. I can't write this stuff. It was just like, so I asked him, like, do you remember what the theme is this week? Learning through hard stuff. Yeah, absolutely. Like sometimes things are hard. This is the growth mindset, right? And I said, I was learning something new recently. I picked up archery, and I was practicing with my bow and my arrows on my target in the backyard. And when I started, I was missing that target left and right. And, it was frustrating. I kind of wanted to quit, but I stuck with it. And guess what happened? I'm getting bullseyes now, and I keep on moving farther out, but I had to start close and I had to make some mistakes and I had to stick with it. And he was like, and told me a story about how he was the best archer there ever was. And, I could see his confidence kind of like, I'm great at bow and arrow. And I could see his confidence balloon up. And I said, all right, well, I want you to get back out there and you might mess up, but see if you can get a little bit, just go a little bit further each time and don't quit. And so I got to just kind of slide back on the side of the porch and watch him get back out there. And, the first time instead of getting caught up on the first jump, he got 2. And then he went again, and then he got 5, and then he went again, and he made it through the whole rhythmic song that they were singing through the jump rope. And so that's a growth mindset, is that, with the fixed mindset, it can so early in our lives, in children's lives, that idea of, I'm not good at that. Sometimes a kid will come to us in, 4th, 5th grade and say like, I'm not good at math. And I'll usually say like, whoa, when did you make up that story? Because we just make up these stories about ourselves that we're not good at this or that, or, just not a natural in that sense. And so we focus on a growth mindset because that really sets us up to be resilient, lifelong learners, to develop that tenacity and perseverance, to just keep on trying, embrace the mistakes, get a little messy. That's why we don't have, red pen all over worksheets, and things like that. It's not about, like, we celebrate mistakes. And, if you haven't messed up a few times already today, then, are you trying hard enough?
Mm. Yeah, I can see that if growth requires doing hard things and failing, it's inherently uncomfortable. There's there's
Yes.
emotions that occur when you take on something new. And if I don't know how to feel that, if avoiding feeling is my goal, if I don't want to feel frustrated, if I don't want to feel upset, I don't want to feel embarrassed, then yeah, I'm going to never try anything. I'm going to just stay in my bubble of comfort zone as much as possible. So I can see how learning to develop my feelings, being okay with failure, being uncomfortable, being disappointed, being embarrassed, whatever, would allow me to take more risks, learn more things, put myself out.
Yeah. We talk about leaning into our growth edge, and that's getting out of our comfort zone.
Yeah.
And that is essential for growth.
Now, if you want to create soldiers or workers, I can see where emotions would not be very useful. You do not want people connected to their frustration at working on the assembly line, or their anger at being given orders that they don't agree with, and you certainly wouldn't want them empathizing with other people who are being mistreated, and then having the desire to organize to fix that or stand up for them, right? You want people separated from each other, separated from their emotions. So I could see how the school system works very well. It did for me, to teach feelings aren't allowed, feelings are weak, learn how to be fine in very uncomfortable or painful circumstance, learn to endure suffering is kind of what I learned from school. And to do that, I had to shut down my feelings.
Right. And how's that working out in our society today?
Yeah. Relationships are awful. Violent. I mean, violence is very clear that violence and crime come from this emotional repression kind of place.
And all the post-traumatic stress disorder, these kinds of stuffed emotions coming out sideways in terrible outbursts of violence are absolutely from deep repression of trauma, and it's going to find a way out somehow.
Yeah, I believe cancer and body pain and stomach and gut issues and all these physical issues, a lot of those are these stuffed emotions. So it's really great to see this. There's a big revolution in parenting on teaching toddlers how to express their feelings, not using shame, moving away from punishment and reward, which is really cool about it, the schools. But then they go to school and they have all that just right back. Yeah. So thanks. Okay. So social emotional learning, SEL. What's the second one?
So from there, I would say a second core tenet of a model of transformative education is having a mentorship, right? A mentorship-based model. So what does that look like? I mentioned in my story before, having great teachers, but not necessarily having a guide who pointed me back towards myself. And this mentorship-based model, if education is about self-actualization, then we need real mentors to support whole humans in their development. We call at the Whole Life Learning Center, we call the educators there, the adults, our mentors. That's because they're not just teachers teaching subjects and developing specific aptitudes in the learners there. They are mentors working, helping kids develop physically, emotionally, intellectually, and spiritually, and helping them discover those unique gifts and help them navigate their own path in the world.
Yeah, so it's that relationship between the adult, the teacher, the guide, the mentor, and the student is key. It's like a relationship of like trust and
Yes.
mutual respect. I would not say that my teachers in the traditional school system ever thought that was their goal, for me to respect them, or they wanted me to respect them by like obeying them.
Respect their
But they were
authority.
perfectly fine for me to fear them, or, like they didn't need me to love them or have intimate. It was no intimacy, right? It was like you show up, you do your thing. If I don't notice you, you're doing it well. Like basically the one
Mhm.
who gets attention is either sucking up or disrupting and
Right.
trying to
Yeah.
get
It
by.
wasn't necessarily the goal for you to feel cared for and really seen in that classroom and it's not necessarily their fault, right? Because they're in a system that is judging them and evaluating them by the numbers, the performance of their pupils. And so they're in that system. And we should also say that there are, in that traditional model of education, there are plenty of inspired educators working to do great things who really do care for their students and are helping them develop, helping them know themselves. I really trust that there are educators and administrators throughout, different schools and traditional models that are working to do that. But it comes back to that. It's like a stick in a river,
Yeah.
that they're, hopefully they're able to reach this, a few students, but we're not setting up we don't have a mentorship model. So when I was looking for the kind of school that I wanted to work at, that's what I was looking for. I wanted to be a mentor, and I wanted to work with kids and really help them develop body, mind, heart, and spirit. And when I couldn't find that, is when my wife Caroline and I set to work to creating the Whole Life Learning Center. And to reflect what you said earlier, around really being based on relationship and trust and care. Some of my mentors, Ba and Josette Lovemore, who've done great things out of the Pacific Northwest, got to work with them. They developed a program called Natural Learning Relationships. And they really make the point that learning doesn't happen except through relationship. Relationship is the conduit for learning and growth, and the quality of our relationships, meaning care and trust in those relationships, determines the quality of our learning. So we really have to be, as mentors, we have to model that emotional intelligence, that care, that growth mindset for our learners to really soak it up. I mean, think about the things that you might have learned through your education. We don't necessarily remember facts from 10th grade history or whatever it was, 7th grade literature or college biology. But we do remember that teacher who was so alive and so loved what they were doing that it was contagious. I think it was Fred Rogers who said that great teachers are really just people who love what they're doing so much that they are there to share it. So that piece, we remember the folks who were lit up, and that they're modeling that kind of love of learning and of developing and sharing those gifts.
I also remember the ones who were deeply suffering and caused all of us
Those
to
two.
suffer. Like, I remember the trauma. So yes, you remember how it
Same.
felt more than what the content was. And
Exactly.
the teachers that are working really hard, I think a lot of teachers go into it with that idea of being this support for kids, being this guide. And if they're able to do it, they do it despite the system, under-resourced, not enough time, not a system focused on it. So how do you create a system that encourages this and allows for the teachers to be mentors and guides like that?
Well, first of all, we have to get rid of this idea that their kids are in some kind of competition, and that these standards, that we're evaluating them based on all of these metrics and standards. We have to set them free to really bring their curriculum to life, to really meet each student where they're at. And from there, we're looking at growth. We're looking at everyone being challenged, everyone being seen and supported. That way they can really do that work and not be caught up in some artificial process of trying to make sure that every set. Yeah. How do we set our mentors up for success in working with kids in a model like this, a mentorship based model? First, we need to set them free as educators to bring the curriculum to life. We have a curriculum guide at the Whole Life Learning Center that has those I mentioned weekly themes and quotes of the week. We've got all of our, in every subject matter, we've got different monthly topics and quarterly themes even, and things that carry us through the year and things that we're exploring and covering, whether that be in science or art or literacy. But I describe that curriculum guide to our mentors like a coloring book, and they get to bring their box of crayons, or maybe they want to bring markers, and they get to fill out that curriculum guide and bring their own inspirations to it. Maybe they have a certain passion in science, and that's naturally going to be reflected in the way that they develop. Maybe they have a passion for poetry, and that starts to come through in their lessons and things like that. They have to be able to be set free to bring that, because then they're modeling that lifelong learning. So second, they should be allowed to color outside the lines, right? This isn't the traditional model of curriculum delivery and then testing for memorization and regurgitation. This is about working with whole life learners, with inspiring lifelong learners. So we need to model that. And that might change with current events. That might change with something that happens with, maybe it's a loss within our community, or something that's going on in our neighborhood, something environmentally where we can get out there and make a difference. The educators need to be free to say, you know what, I'm going to pivot. And this is really what's up right now in our class and our community. So we're going to spend some time talking about it, talking about what solutions might be, and then working towards those.
Mhm. And so practically, it seems like there's like a lower teacher to student ratio seems important here, to have some some time and energy to connect, to feel there. So I know that you have what, 2 teachers in the classrooms.
We
So
do.
yeah, it's like what, like a kind of a roughly 1 to 10 is your
Exactly.
max.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, we
Which
do team teaching. So like
mhm.
a lead mentor and or a sometimes co-lead mentors, or a lead mentor and a support mentor. Sometimes those support mentors support with that specialization, having a specialty class in one of our electives, art, music, Spanish, eco studies. We've got movement classes, things like that. But also, one of the ways that we really take time for mentorship is through the whole life learning curriculum. We have things like activities like vision boards, where we're mapping out what kind of world do I want to, what kind of life do I want to have? What kind of world do I want to help to create? And what does that look like? What are the images, and the vision that I want to see on front of my binder every day when I show up to school? We do heart maps, where we're mapping out those inspirations and putting down all the things that we love, from our friends and family and community to our hobbies and our goals and aspirations, and just getting that organized. And that offers so much insight for those mentors to see those vision boards and heart maps. And when someone's feeling stuck or feeling like the learning isn't relevant for them, they don't get it, I can always look back at that heart map and say, well, what if we, I see Legos all over that. What if we tried to model this out, this scientific concept? What if we could do that with Legos? And all of a sudden it's like, ding, they light up, and we've got an inroad. We can go from there. And then, and from that, we develop personal, like whole life learning plans, and personal learning plans that honor body, mind, heart, and spirit, that teach them how to really set goals and envision steps to achieve those goals, find people to support them, and work towards those goals and accomplish the things they set their minds to.
Yeah, I was getting Della's feedback on her teachers for the upcoming teacher parent conference. And she said her favorite thing about her teacher is how she understands how to be with her in her feelings. That was her favorite.
Mm.
She knows how to be with me when I'm upset, when I have my feelings. And And the other teacher, I asked her for everything about him, and she's like, "I like it when he raps." So it just was like two very different things, but like very them, like knowing the two of them. Like, and he also said that he's a lot like me. And I was like, "Oh, and like what? He has great hair or what?" And she's like, "No, he's just like he raps and he's like fun and nice and like he's just like cool dad, and
That's huge.
that was the vibe she got from her two teachers, which is just so different than what I had.